Hello, my name is Nick Voulvoulis, and I'm a professor of environmental technology at the Center of Environmental Policy at Imperial College in London. And this talk is on the environmental impacts of cigarette smoking, focusing on tobacco's global footprint. Most of tobacco's global production is used for the manufacturing of cigarettes. Around 6 trillion cigarettes are produced annually to be consumed by 1.1 billion smokers, with tobacco smoking causing 7.7 million deaths annually, including 1 in 5 deaths in males worldwide. The tobacco industry profits from the production and sale of the most deadly consumer good on the market. And while the health effects of cigarette smoking are well recognized and documented, the environmental impacts of tobacco are less appreciated and often overlooked. So the scale of the damage caused to the environment by the tobacco industry has historically been unreported. Although some companies produce sustainability reports and some life cycle assessments, the assumptions and methodologies used for these studies are not always transparent and very often not complete. Assessments are limited to manufacturing processes and producers' immediate supply chains, leaving out important steps like the tobacco growing, curing, distribution, and also the final disposal of cigarette butts. So from tobacco cultivation, curing, processing, cigarette manufacturing, distribution to use and disposal, the tobacco industry's supply chain is global and extensive. In our work, we try to understand the environmental impacts of the whole supply chain, and we published our work in a paper in the journal Environmental Science and Technology, which you can read for more information. So for our study, a cumulative mass balance model was produced using material flow analysis, an established analytical method for quantifying flows and stocks of materials and substances, with the environmental footprint of cigarette smoking captured from cradle to grave using life cycle assessment. This is also a well-established and internationally standardized method for assessing the potential environmental and health impacts of goods and services. We used available data and made transparent assumptions based on international best practices where data gap existed. So using this model, we were able to calculate the total annual input, waste, and emission flows across the global tobacco supply chain. The total material inputs for the global production of 6 trillion cigarettes amounted to 27.2 megatons. The energy inputs exceeded 62 million gigajoules, and the water inputs went over 22,000 megatons, with the total arable land input for the process reaching 5.3 million hectares. It was calculated that a total of 32.4 megatons of green tobacco leaf were cultivated on 4 million hectares of land, producing the 6.48 megatons of dry tobacco used to manufacture the 6 trillion cigarettes sticks across 500 factories worldwide. However, we have to say that tobacco cultivation was found to be concentrated primarily in low and middle-income regions. None of the top 10 tobacco producing countries were developing, and 4 of those were actually low-income food deficit countries like India, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, and Malawi. And in most of these countries, the majority of all tobacco produced is destined for exports, with less than 20% consumed locally. So the total carbon footprint of the tobacco sector is about 84 million tons of CO2 equivalent, approximately 0.2% of the global total, and comparable to emission levels of entire countries such as Peru and Israel. It also contributes to water depletion of over 22 billion cubic meters and 21 million tons oil equivalent of fossil fuel depleted, levels equivalent again to the total primary energy consumption of countries like New Zealand and Hungary. 5.3 million hectares of fertile land is used to grow tobacco that otherwise could be produce enough food to feed up to 20 million people. So, for example, the 2 stages out of the whole supply chain contributing most to climate change are the ones related to tobacco farming and curing. These are the 2 stages not often included in tobacco industry's corporate social responsibility reports, underestimating significantly the contribution of the sector. Indeed, when you look at the annual resource depletion per ton of produced and consumed tobacco, and the total across the tobacco supply chain, you can see the impacts in terms of water depletion, metal depletion, fossil fuel depletion, agricultural land occupation, urban land occupation, and natural land transformation, all categories in the life cycle assessment. This is significant for a number of small island developing states, which allocate substantial parts to their land resources to commercial tobacco growing. Countries such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Fiji, and Jamaica all have at least 600 hectares of arable land under tobacco. Even some of the smallest countries in the world, like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Mauritius, have parts of their scarce arable land allocated to tobacco. When you consider the environmental impacts of a lifetime of smoking, for example, a person smoking 20 cigarettes a day for 50 years, a typical cigarette has shown to have a water footprint of about 3.7 liters, a climate change contribution of 40 grams of CO2 equivalents, and a fossil fuel depletion contribution of 3.5 grams of oil equivalent. Now, this doesn't sound much, but comparing to other activities, in 1 year a smoker contributes almost 5 times more to water depletion and nearly 2 and 10 times more to fossil fuel depletion than an average consumer of red meat and sugar, respectively, and 4 times more to climate change than a sugar consumer. Now, it's important to consider these resource needs and impacts in terms of the current environmental and climate change crisis we are facing. The world, as we know, is facing global challenges and constraints due to resource depletion, wasteful and harmful production and consumption, and the emerging impacts of climate change. The toll on the environment was reflected in the joint climate and environment emergency declared by the UK Parliament in May 2019, as well as the European Parliament in November the same year, recognizing the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions and address overconsumption of the planet's limited resources. While people are asked to change their diets, their habits, travel less, and even have fewer children, sacrificing some of the benefits and experiences in response to climate change, with smoking, the only benefit is related to multinational profits. So as you can see from this map, by smoking, the developed world is literally burning poorer countries' resources. Almost 90% of all production of tobacco is concentrated in the developing world. Environmental burden, therefore, falls on countries least able to cope with it, but the profits are made by transnational tobacco companies based in higher income countries. Tobacco competes with essential commodities for resources and places significant pressures on the health of our planet and its most vulnerable inhabitants. So tobacco companies also hinder progress with Sustainable Development Goals, and not just the environmental SDGs, but also the ones related to decent work and economic growth, quality education, poverty, and zero hunger. In Zimbabwe, for example, a hectare of land would produce 19 times more potatoes than the 1.2 to 1.2 tons of tobacco currently cultivated. An average tobacco farmer in Kenya will take home about $120 per year after covering all their expenses. And this amount of money is barely enough to put food on the table, especially when you consider that the labor costs are not something that the farmer normally calculates into their bottom line. It is for that reason that reducing tobacco consumption needs to be identified as a key lever for achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals. The truth is that despite its enormous profitability, the industry bears few of the health and environmental costs caused by producing its products, and tobacco companies are not accountable for the environmental damage caused by the production, use, and end of life of cigarettes. It is unacceptable that the industry can continue to make billions in profits while washing its hands of the destructive environmental impacts of smoking, and hopefully we can all work together to make that happen. Thank you for listening, and can I also thank my colleagues Maria Zafiridou and Professor Nick Hopkinson from Imperial, who also worked in the study for the WHO, and which results I presented to you today. Thank you for listening.